I think we start where we left off last time we covered it on stream. So last time we covered these talks on stream, the way the deal was being presented by the media, as it was getting reported about the 600,000 troop cap and Ukraine having to give up all of the Donbass, including the territories that the Russians have not taken, the Ukrainians having to split the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and its energy between themselves and the Russians, the Ukrainians having to give up any war crimes prosecutions for any of the people who hunted humans in Kherson, or any of the Russian soldiers who engaged in war crimes in Bucha, or any of the Russian bombers who targeted civilian infrastructure or attacked civilian infrastructure. Just completely give it up. Anybody who tortured Ukrainian POWs, completely give all that up. And it was a catalog of Russian centered and Russian government friendly agreements. There did not seem to be much, if anything, on the pathway, on the path side of defending Ukraine, besides the fact that there was an agreement that if the Russians tried to attack Ukraine in the future, that there would be some response from the United States, some response that was both in the way of snapback sanctions and also possibly some sort of military response. So it isn't exactly Budapest Memorandum 2.0, because before it was just a vague agreement to do something, but it is not too far off from a Budapest Memorandum 2.0. You could maybe call it, maybe not Budapest, you have to call it by different, Istanbul 1.0, right? Which is still not where you need to go, but it's Istanbul 1.0. So that seemed to be where we were last time we discussed this. And I said all the reasons why I did not think it was workable. Number one, I said I didn't think it was workable because a limitation on the Ukrainian armed force of 600,000, I thought was too low. I thought it was too low because right now the Ukrainian armed force is supposed to be between 800,000 and 900,000. And with these numbers, it is difficult for them to hold the line. And so if at this number, it is difficult for the Ukrainians to hold the line, why would we limit them below this? If the Russians are saying that this is inevitable, they're going to win XYZ with these advances, then what's the problem with Ukraine having its limitation be about where its army size is currently, right? Now, I don't think we need to discuss whether or not Ukraine can retrofit a troop limitation to make it so that they can be above that, say by having some sort of volunteer police force in each city, or certain hunting clubs along these cities where people could quickly sign up to service. Something along those lines to make it so even if you have a limitation of 600,000, 700,000, 800,000, you can get a quickly, another 50,000 to 100,000 in a moment of crisis. Maybe there could be something where you have an emergency response force, which is a sort of emergency personnel that also happens to be trained on military equipment, whether it be certain heavy vehicles or even just rifles, because you're going to need a certain amount of infantry to hold the trenches, as this war shows, and warfare will always show. But I thought the troop limitation of 600,000 was too low, and I think in principle it would be difficult for the Ukrainians to agree to. So at the very least, it had to be increased. I thought that the categorical handover of any territory which the Ukrainians currently control to the Russians is going to be a political killer for Zelensky. And the assumption made, and I really want to sink this point home, the assumption made that the current corruption crisis within the Zelensky government, within his former broadcast business colleagues, Timur Mindich, who fled the country after being part of this infrastructure scheme that was taking money in order from any agreement made with any contract made, taking 10% off the top, or around any agreement to protect crucial infrastructure. This is something that really damaged the image of the government. This is something that is particularly bad considering that Zelensky just a few months ago was trying to eliminate the independence of the very organizations that is bringing this evidence to light, which then puts a whole new series of questions out as to why it was timed like that when they tried to eliminate this. The assumption from the American government was, oh, now's the time to go because Zelensky's weak on the home front. The problem is, if Zelensky's weak on the home front, it's going to be much more difficult for him to get the Ukrainian public to swallow difficult demands. It's going to be much more difficult for him to say, you know what, actually, not only are we going to allow Mariupol, allow all these different cities like Donetsk to continue to be occupied for an indefinite period of time with no immediate answer as to when they will no longer be occupied, because the government has not agreed that any of this territory is going to be Russian or going to be part of Russia, but to then agree on top of that to give up further territory that the Ukrainian government has successfully defended up until now, including territory that many Ukrainians, like if you're from Kramatorsk, think about it from their perspective. You just fought 4 years and your city is still in your hands and the negotiations are going on right now. And you could be thinking, my goodness, it could end and I could go home. And, you know, I would love it if my neighbors were able to go back to their homes, but I'll be able to go back to mine. And just having this dangled in front of you, whether or not you're, you know, will you stay or will you go back to your home? Will you stay and try to fight for it? Will you go back to your home with the war ending, or will you just see your government sell it from under you? It's a very difficult question, a very difficult demand that I don't think is going to be fulfilled, especially if Zelensky is weak on the home front. So I think this political calculation made by the Trump government that as Zelensky has to deal with these domestic corruption crises, now is the time to press forward. I think that's wrong. If his hope was that it would hurt Zelensky domestically, so he'll be weak and won't be able to reject demands for peace, then he still is fundamentally miscalculating how Ukrainians view the war and how they want an end to it, but they certainly don't even want to agree necessarily to all the territory that's being occupied being part of Russia, let alone them giving up territory that is not occupied and is defensible. And it is territory that would take the Russians a lot of manpower, a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of resources to take. And if they did have it, and if they did take it, they could use as a launching pad to go into other areas deeper into Ukraine, Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Kharkiv, etc. And so I just fundamentally did not think the Ukrainian government was going to agree to that demand. So I thought that territorial demand, I thought the troop limitation, and I also thought that the sneaker demands in there, like I already talked about the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, but there's a sneaker demand in there for Poland. I keep calling it a sneaker demand because not a lot of attention to it. There's a demand that American planes will not be stationed in Warsaw, Poland. And the Polish were never contacted about it. They were never asked about it. And so this was something that was being put forward, and the demand that was going to be put forward over to Kiev, list of demands that was going to be made to them, where the Polish were never consulted. And when there were further consultations with Europe, it was the Germans, it was the French, the whole host of people. Again, not the Polish, not in Geneva, not in Geneva. And so I got to say, probably rubbing the Polish the wrong way. I imagine part of it is because the Polish, even with Doraki, stands to be one of the more pro-Ukrainian positions in Europe in comparison to other capitals because of their immediate defensive national interests. And so they might be worried by having them in the room. It might blow up negotiations. But if negotiations are that fragile that just a slight advocation on behalf of the Ukrainians could blow up the whole thing, doesn't really sound like it's very stable to begin with, to be quite frank. To be quite frank. So the Polish are not allowed in the room, but then there are demands made of the Polish and the jets that are going to be stationed in Poland. This immediate list of demands were never going to work. I said it at the time. And it seems to be that the immediate reaction to this was, and this was a confirmation of my worst fears, is this is not super negotiable. This is a list of demands being made to the Ukrainians. You got to figure this out because we're not going to be able to come and defend you. And what Army Driscoll, what Mr. Driscoll said, Vance's old buddy in the army, to the Ukrainians of, we don't really have the capacity to change the situation on the battlefield, seemed to be kind of a take it or leave it situation. Now, the immediate reaction from the White House was, yes, this is the list of demands. The immediate reaction from Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State, who is also the National Security Advisor, who has held these two positions only in a capacity that has been held by one other man before in human history, and that is Henry Kissinger, holding these positions at the same time. And Henry Kissinger said it was too difficult for him. So we'll see how Mr. Marco does. But he said to a bunch of people in the Senate, don't worry, this is just a list of Russian demands. These are Russian-centric demands, obviously. Don't worry about it. This will be negotiated. And then from there, later, a few hours, he had to say, no, actually, this is the deal. Now, later, as this continued to go on, and maybe as Trump got more slack and there was more response from Europe in a very negative fashion, there was response from, of course, Zelensky in a negative fashion, not directly towards the White House, but he went to his public, he went to his people and said, look, we are being put in a position where we have to choose between our nation's dignity or our friend. And I think the White House was surprised at the fact that Zelensky felt that he could communicate in that way to the Ukrainian public, and that this isn't this is a difficult conversation to have. But if anything, this is something that, from Zelensky's point of view, might be able to buoy him by attaching himself to Ukraine's most defensible, like he's the man who will stand up for Ukraine's national interests. He's the man that will get in there and try to defend every inch of Ukrainian territory possible. If he can attach himself to that, irrespective of all the corruption scandals, then in this moment, some Ukrainians are going to say, look, I don't particularly like him, but I mean, he's our guy. I mean, I know he's going to stand on this issue. And I talked to people about this, and this is something that, many have alluded to me. So if Zelensky attaches himself to this, it might allow him to actually defend his position at the home front more. Not to mention, of course, what is in Ukraine's national interest to begin with. So I didn't see that previous deal having any success. Marco Rubio had to say it was actually not their deal. It was Russian, to the senators who were just aghast at what they were being told was the new proposal before having to reverse course. But then after all of the backlash, eventually this 28-point peace plan has now been trimmed down to a 19-point plan. 19 points. They've renegotiated areas of it. And the way that it's being covered right now, and I'm just going to be blunt with you guys, the way these headlines are being written, I don't like. Ukraine agrees to peace deal, U.S. official says. Okay. It's true that Ukraine has agreed to a peace deal. That is true. This is the headline I found that was the most unegregious, right? And it was, and I'm giving Fox credit here, okay? But a lot of these headlines are being written almost like, huzzah, it's been achieved. Or huzzah, like, woo, Ukraine has finally agreed to a peace agreement. We've finally gotten there. Huzzah, right? As if this is in some way an achievement. You could say it's an achievement in the idea that you have formally acknowledged that Ukraine wants peace, but Ukraine has formally acknowledged the wants of peace before. They've also acknowledged the want of a ceasefire before the U.S. administration abandoned their pursuance of a ceasefire. All this agreement did, and I'm really sad to say it, all this agreement did that we know of is change that 600,000 threshold to 800,000, which is a massive improvement. And it also acknowledged that the Ukrainians are going to continue to want to aspire to be in organizations like NATO, because it did not bar them from joining organizations like NATO in the future. So that took that off the table. Those are two significant movements, and I think they should at least be acknowledged. But what the White House has acknowledged, what the opposition has acknowledged in Ukraine, what the government has acknowledged in Ukraine, what everybody has acknowledged is that the two areas of biggest disagreement is territory and security guarantees. Territory and security guarantees. These are the two biggest areas of disagreement. Now, they say that they've basically inked a deal. The White House is talking very hopefully, like, hey, you know, we've got there. We're there. Woohoo. We've inked a deal. We inked an agreement. But there's only some, see how it says in the byline here. Some minor details of Russia-Ukraine peace agreement still to be decided, official notes. The minor details are still territory and security guarantees. So the two biggest points of disagreement, which I remember when 6 months ago, JD Vance, when they were being asked, hey, remember you guys said 24 hours? You guys said it would be over in 24 hours. What have you guys achieved in 6 months? Well, we have now narrowed down what the demands are, and we know that the biggest areas of disagreement are security guarantees, so this doesn't happen again, and territory. Who's going to control what? And now the minor disagreements that are holding them up are the same minor disagreements that held them up 6 months ago. Territory, as the Russians are demanding the control of the entirety of the Donbass as a precondition to use this as a foundation to negotiate. Mind you, Vladimir Putin responded to the original proposal that was circulating in the press by saying this could be a good foundation, meaning that there's a good chance that wasn't even going to be the end of what the Russians requested, that the Russian demands were going to go further. Maybe it wasn't even 600,000. Maybe it should have been 400,000 or 300,000. Mind you, at the start of the invasion, Ukraine had an army of 250,000 men. And the demands that the Russians made at Istanbul is that they cut that army more than in half. So that would mean an army of 125,000. So the idea that the Russians would push for more and more and more to try to get somewhere close to those original demands, that's not that crazy. But the fact that we're now acknowledging the fact that Ukraine could have an army as much as 800,000 is now the current negotiating line for the new proposal compared to what the Russians were demanding at the start. Anybody who says, oh, the Ukrainians fought for nothing. Oh, the Ukrainians, they have gotten nothing. Oh, the Ukrainian position is now weaker than it was at the start of the invasion. If at the start of the invasion, the Russians were demanding that the Ukrainians have an army of 125,000, and now the current goal line for the peacetime cap, and that's an important word, peacetime cap is 800,000, irrespective of the fact that the Ukrainians can use other methods to get militias and, you know, police volunteer forces, hunting clubs that, you know, could easily volunteer. All of this other stuff, veterans organizations that could continue to, you know, have, you know, monthly trainings in, you know, school and school backyards or whatever, you know, in playgrounds or jungle gyms or wherever they would go and practice. Point is, that's a big shift, but the two main sticking points are still sticking points. And calling them minor details is kind of burying the lead for what is major details and have been the main details, as acknowledged by all parties, that have been holding up negotiations for the entirety of Trump's time in office and for Biden's time in office. So how much progress has been made, really? I mean, progress has been made on the fact that there is some agreement that 600,000 is preposterous, and that even if we're negotiating a limitation on a Ukrainian army, it's so far from what the Russians originally demanded. But then we also have to acknowledge that the idea of a limitation on the aggressed upon state in and of itself is still preposterous, considering it is the aggressor, the aggressor state, the state that did the invading, that started the war, that would traditionally be the state that actually has a limitation placed upon it so it does not repeat behavior. So in principle, there's something wrong with this, yes? But there's a question about impracticality. This is end up limiting the Ukrainian armed forces. And so that's probably the most major change, is we're getting to a somewhat more realistic number for a peacetime cap if there was to be one. Not saying that there should be, but that's seeming to be where negotiations are headed on that front. But as for the territorial line, the Ukrainians are not going to be able to budge on this. And I think right now Zelensky is given even less room to budge on this. And so I do not believe that the Ukrainians are going to give up Kramatorsk in these talks, and that they're going to have to draw the red line there. And therefore, the Trump administration is going to be put in the position to either make the Russians take a deal where they don't take territory they don't currently hold, since they already have a land corridor spanning from, Ras Vandan all the way through the southern part of the Dnieper River, through southern Kherson and southern Zaporizhia, and they have the city of Mariupol. There's no need for the Ukrainians to have to displace more people. There's no need for the Ukrainians to have to dismount the defensive works that would only be a problem if the Russians intended to do further offensive operations. There's no need for that. No need for that at all. So will Trump make them? I don't think he will be able to, without further action showing that they're willing to put more on the line here, i.e., stronger sanctions, i.e., targeting the Shadow Fleet, i.e., getting Ukraine the munitions necessary to conduct itself with aggression in the war. But I don't think we're anywhere closer to that. And from the way that the Army Secretary is talking, it seems like we're further away from that right now than we have been in a while in the Trump administration. Considering 2 weeks ago, we just saw the first sanctions really kick into effect, and we're supposed to say, yippee, maybe we'll compel the Russians somewhere. This kind of back and forth, we're going to corner the Ukrainians and corner the Russians, try to corner them into talks together to try to be a mediator instead of a Ukrainian backer to change the physical realities on the battlefield to make peace more likely. I think we've truly misaligned our role here, and through that process made peace less likely. If we needed a mediary, we could have gotten Oman. There's a million mediaries that could have done the job. If you really wanted a regional player, you could have gotten the Turks. Could have gotten the Turks. Could have gotten the Turks. There's no need for us to be doing it.